Brian Welker couldn't help but smile as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Earlier in the day, he had been promoted to shift foreman at Harding Containers, effective immediately. The icing on the cake was working the night shift for the foreseeable future. Most people hated the night shift, but the timing was great for Brian. His son was a junior in high school and participated in several sports and clubs. By working nights, Brian would be able to attend his son's activities without missing work. Brian had worked the night shift more than a few times over the years and had developed a system for sleeping during the day that made it work for him. That was why he was crawling across roof trusses in his attic on a warm August afternoon. He had been given Thursday and Friday off with pay after being informed of the promotion. It was an opportunity to rest and prepare for his new position starting on Sunday night. Brian had long planned to create a small apartment over his detached garage. It would become his refuge where he could peacefully sleep during the day and avoid the usual interruptions. Brian was running a cable to provide internet in his new apartment. The Wi-Fi signal in the house simply did not reach the apartment, so he decided to place an extender in the end of his house attic nearest his garage, hoping it would give a strong signal inside his apartment. As he worked, Brian heard faint sounds coming from inside his house. It was early afternoon, so his wife Brenda would be at work, and their son Tim was visiting Brenda's parents for a few days. The house should have been empty. Brian crawled over the trusses toward the area from which the noises were coming. After moving closer, he determined the sounds were coming from his bedroom. Conversation became clearer as Brian settled over an unused air conditioning vent in his bedroom ceiling. Brenda had insisted the old vent was blowing cold air on her at night, causing her frequent neck aches. He had installed a new vent as far from Brenda's side of the bed as possible, but never bothered to remove the old one, which would have required repairing the hole in the ceiling. Brian gently lifted the insulation resting on the attic floor and uncovered the vent. He felt a pang in his gut when he saw Brenda with another man. Despite the painful scene, Brian was unable to look away. He set his phone to video and carefully placed it on the vent, ensuring the camera had an unobstructed view of the bed. "I love how close we are," the man said quietly. "Does your husband ever connect with you like this, or does he have a different way of showing affection?" "I've asked you not to mention Brian," Brenda protested softly. "This isn't about him. He's a good partner and a great father." "I'm about to finish," the man continued. "And yet you say you're happy with him. Doesn't something feel off about that?" "I don't know why I agreed to do this here," Brenda said. "There's no risk of being caught in your apartment. This is just so intense," she sighed. The man pulled back slightly. "Do you see how thrilling it is when you take risks? Being together in my place is one thing, but doing this in your own home takes it to another level." Brian recognized the man as Bill Grant, a driver for the parcel delivery company where both he and Brenda worked. Bill was recently divorced and had a daughter in Tim's class. "That sounds terrible," Brenda responded without much emotion. "You wanted to have sex in my bed because it turns you on to think you've outdone Brian. You act like it's a competition or something." "It is a competition, at least for men," replied Bill with a soft chuckle. "You're a sexy woman, and the sex is great. But knowing you're married and I'm with you in your husband's bed makes me feel like a winner." "It feels incredible," Grant said. "It wouldn't be as satisfying if Brian caught us here. I don't know why I agreed to this, but it won't happen again. I'm worried about Brian discovering us. It would ruin my marriage," admitted Brenda. "Let's make a deal," suggested Grant. "As long as you keep your husband out of the picture, I won't insist we do it in his bed. Once he's out of the way, we can continue our arrangement. I'll be back to reclaim my place as your lover." "I'm not going to refuse Brian," Brenda said. "He's my husband. I can't just shut him out and expect everything to go smoothly." "Brian's a man and wants sex regularly," Grant replied. "You do what you have to do, but remember, I'll be with you in this very bed as soon as possible. If you keep him satisfied, it might be exciting for you too. Look, I'll try to discourage Brian from getting intimate and keep our meetings in my bedroom to a minimum," Brenda said. "I don't want to think about what would happen if Brian ever caught us." Brian had parked his truck inside the detached garage, hidden from view. Brenda had no idea he was home, and certainly didn't know he was listening to her conversation. His face was covered in sweat, dripping steadily onto the insulation below. He forced himself to stay still, resisting the urge to vomit as he listened to the couple get dressed and leave. As Brian made his way to the ladder, he considered what he had just learned. He had discovered his wife's betrayal and realized that she was planning to keep their intimate life minimal to please her lover. Brian managed a grim smile, thinking that Brenda would have no trouble withholding intimacy from him because she would no longer be sharing that part of her life with him. He resolved to focus on his son, Tim, who had 2 years of high school left. Brian decided to put his efforts into making his new apartment functional and comfortable, turning it into his living space for the next year and a half. He would need a small kitchen and a full bathroom by the time Tim graduated and went to college. Brian contacted contractors to get estimates, deciding to hire a company to complete the work quickly and professionally. He realized that his time was more valuable than saving money by doing the work himself. His promotion would easily cover the expenses. Brian's perspective had shifted significantly. He was no longer invested in his old way of life and was determined to make sure Tim's college education was fully funded. Beyond that, he planned to rebuild his life and enjoy it. By the time Brenda walked in after work, Brian had gained control of his emotions. "Did you get off early?" Brenda asked, noticing Brian sitting in the kitchen. Brian looked at Brenda and saw her differently. She had some lines and carried a few extra pounds. Had his feelings for her blinded him to her faults? He was saddened by his sudden change in attitude but recognized it was her choice to have an affair, and he was simply reacting. "Yeah, I'm working nights for a while, starting tonight," Brian explained. "They let me come home to pack a lunch and rest before I head back. It's a bit of a jam at work." "They shouldn't ask you to work nights after a day shift," Brenda said. "At least lie down and sleep for a few hours." "Good idea," Brian responded. "I'll just go to the guest room and wait." Brenda, recalling the condition of their bed, insisted, "I just remembered I need to wash the bed linens." "Okay," Brian said calmly, chuckling to himself at Brenda's discomfort. "I'll use the bed in the guest room. There's no need to get so excited." A few hours later, Brian left the house as if he were going to work. He stopped at a local sports bar, watched a baseball game, and enjoyed a few beers. He had previously set up an air mattress in his future apartment. Once he was sure Brenda would be asleep, he parked inside the garage and went up the stairs to his air mattress. He slept surprisingly well. One of the contractors Brian interviewed the next day was between projects and offered a very good price if Brian agreed to start immediately. The contractor's crew would be moving to a new development in 2 weeks. Brian agreed and signed the contract for the work to begin Monday morning. His night shift operated from Sunday night through Thursday night. The plant would shut down Friday evening and start up again Sunday night. Brenda knew Brian wouldn't have to work Friday night, so she was surprised when he got ready for bed and headed for the guest room that night. "Why are you going to sleep in the guest room?" Brenda asked, perplexed. "We won't see much of each other while you're on night shift, so why don't you sleep in our bed?" "Since I worked nights last night and slept a few hours this morning while you were at work, I'm not very tired. I plan to watch a baseball game and maybe a movie afterward," Brian explained. "I'm trying to get used to staying awake at night and sleeping during the day. I don't want to disrupt your sleep unless you're thinking we should do something else." Brenda's reaction was just as Brian had expected. If he hadn't overheard her conversation with her lover, he might have missed her brief, startled look before she gave a weak smile. "I'm pretty tired tonight. Maybe we could just cuddle a little and then go to sleep," Brenda suggested. "Besides, Tim's home tonight. He might hear us." "Cuddling won't work for me," Brian said. "I want to be close and feel connected. If that's not going to happen, I'll just sleep in the guest room." "I understand, but I'm really tired and just not in the mood," Brenda said, trying to explain. I hope you understand." "I understand better than you realize," Brian replied. "Let me know if you feel like getting together later." "Good night," he added, turning toward the guest room, leaving Brenda with a confused expression. On Saturday, Brian played catch with Tim for an hour and then did some yard work. When bedtime came, he walked down the hall to the guest bedroom. Brenda watched him with concern, wondering about his behavior. Brian went into work early Sunday night to prepare for his role as shift foreman. By the time the production workers arrived, he felt confident in his new position. He hadn't told Brenda about his promotion, as she had kept secrets from him, so he no longer felt obligated to share everything. His shift went smoothly, and he was well received by his team. The new position brought more responsibility, but Brian was familiar with the issues and knew how to handle them. He settled into his role with minimal difficulty. Brenda had already left for work when the construction crew began setting up. Brian spoke briefly with the job foreman to ensure everything was on track, and then went inside. He fell asleep immediately, but was woken several times by the loud noises from the crew and once by the phone ringing. Annoyed for not turning off the ringer, he answered groggily, "I'm sorry, Brian. Did I wake you up?" Beverly, his mother-in-law, asked, "Is that why you called?" Brian replied with some irritation. "There's no need to get upset," Beverly said. "I just wanted to let you know that Bill and I heard you were on night shift and won't disturb you. If you need us to do anything for Tim while you're sleeping, just let us know." Brian hung up the phone without a response and unplugged it from the wall. He shook his head at the thoughtlessness of others. It took a few minutes, but he eventually fell back asleep. The construction crew completed their work in less than a week. Brian was amazed at how quickly the contractor finished the remodeling. He would have taken months to do it himself. When he woke up Friday afternoon, he drove to a furniture store and ordered a king-sized bed, a small kitchen table with chairs, and a small sofa. Then he went to a major appliance dealer and selected a large flat-screen TV, a refrigerator, an oven, and a microwave. By Monday afternoon, Brian's bachelor pad, as he considered it, would be ready for him to occupy full-time. He chuckled at how perplexed Brenda had been when she came home from work Monday to find a crew of men bustling around the detached garage. She approached Brian as he was chatting with the job foreman and insisted on a private discussion to understand what was going on. "I'm having an apartment finished over the garage," Brian revealed. "I want a place where I can sleep during the day without interruptions or phone calls. It's being double insulated to keep the noise to a minimum, and I won't have a landline there. Since I'll be working nights for some time, it seemed like a good idea to have a space where I can rest without disrupting you and Tim. You won't even know I'm around," Brian continued. "I'll be at Tim's baseball practices and games, and we'll have dinner together. Don't worry about that." Brenda looked concerned. "You mentioned a few days ago that I should let you know when I'm in the mood for something special, but I haven't taken you up on it. Are you asking for something tonight?" Brian responded, "Marriage isn't just about physical intimacy. It involves conversations, sharing ideas, and addressing issues together. If you're not in the mood, I can respect that, but I need to know when you're interested. This arrangement will work fine as long as you communicate with me." Brenda retorted, "I expect more from my husband than just physical satisfaction. I want a sincere apology and a nice evening out at a good restaurant as part of that apology." Brian broke into a big smile and walked away, leaving Brenda confused. He was making it easier to keep Bill Grant from demanding more from her, but Brenda was troubled by Brian's change in behavior. He had always been attentive, and his current distance concerned her. Brian had fully moved into his new apartment by the following Wednesday. The coming weekend promised 3 nights off due to Labor Day, and Tim's junior year would start the following Tuesday. "How would you two like to go to a Diamondbacks game this weekend?" Brian asked at dinner on Thursday. "They're playing the Dodgers, and it should be a great series." "That would be amazing," Tim exclaimed. "I'm not really into baseball," Brenda said. "I'll pass on that offer and find something to do around the house." Brian responded under his breath, but loud enough for Brenda to hear. It's settled then. Tim and I will go to the Saturday night game. Tim was excited. I can't wait to tell Scooter about this. He's a big Dodger fan and used to live in Los Angeles. Why don't you invite him along? Brian suggested. Baseball is more fun with friends, especially those who are fans. Tim raced off to call Scooter and soon returned with good news. Scooter's mom said he can go. Brian observed, baseball is a great way to bond with the boys. Brenda replied, Scooter is a nice, polite young man. His real name is Horace. Brian shook his head and joked, Horace. No wonder he has a nickname. What kind of parent names their child Horace? Brenda continued, Horace's father passed away 2 years ago. He and his mother moved here this summer to be closer to her parents, who are in poor health. Brian chuckled. I'll just stick with calling him Scooter. Saturday afternoon, Tim pulled his truck into the driveway of a nice ranch house. Before he could stop, Scooter was racing out the door and jumped into the truck. Mr. Welker, Mom wants to meet you before we leave. I guess she wants to make sure you're not a serial killer or something. No problem, Brian said as he climbed out of the truck and walked to the house. He rang the bell, and a slender, rather nondescript woman around Brian's age opened the door. With what he felt was a quick glance, Brian determined her legs were her best feature. They were strong and well-shaped. Her running shorts provided a clear view of them, while her stomach was flat and her top hugged her torso closely. My legs look pretty good compared to the rest of me, don't you think? Asked Scooter's mom. To Brian's chagrin, he hesitated before responding. Well yeah, agreed Brian, once he saw the grin on the woman's face. You've got a great pair of legs. Do you think I should let my son go to a baseball game with a man who checks out every woman he sees? Challenged the boy's mother. I'm trying to raise a gentleman. Brian saw the laughter in the woman's eyes and knew instinctively she was teasing him a bit. He decided to play along. What you're really asking is should you let your son go anywhere with a man who appreciates women, which is a part of being a man, replied Brian with a grin. He needs to learn how to appreciate the fair sex. I'll show him what to look for and how to do it. I certainly hope you'll be less obvious during these life lessons you'll be giving Horace, countered the still smiling woman. The first thing I'll teach him is to respond to anyone who calls him Horace with a smile, except his mom, of course, joked Brian. I see my son will learn to be polite and appreciate women's attributes, said Gertrude. Not even clothes, responded Brian. I'll show him the fine art of appreciating people in a respectful way. It's important he has a well-rounded perspective and not focus entirely on any single trait. That's a relief, replied Scooter's mom, gaining even more respect from Brian. Have a good time and be sure Scooter calls if you're going to be late. My name's Gertrude, by the way. Seriously, Gertrude, what do your friends call you? Asked Brian. Oh, for my male friends, I'm called Minks, Raven, Candy, or Bubbles. My girlfriends call me Gertrude, replied the straight-faced woman. Sounds good to me. I'm Brian. We're going to be friends, so I'll call you Minks. I kind of like that name. Why am I not surprised? Responded Gertrude, breaking into a hearty laugh. Horace can go along with you anytime. I love your sense of humor. Tim is a very polite young man, so I was pretty sure his parents would be fine. Thanks for inviting him to the game. We're a baseball family. I used to go to as many Dodgers home games as I could. My father even played in the minor leagues before I was born. He was pretty good, just not quite good enough. Scooter's a great kid, so it's no problem. I'll keep an eye on him and make sure he gets back home in one piece, Minks. Have a nice day. Is that going to stick? I was making a joke, protested Gertrude. You'll always be a Minks to me, was Brian's quick reply as he turned and headed back to the truck. Brian had a relaxing day of the game. Scooter managed to catch a foul ball. Both boys ate too many hot dogs and drank too much soda. They fell asleep in the back seat of the truck before Brian was able to exit the parking lot. When he reached Scooter's home, Brian gently shook the boy awake and escorted the sleepy teen to his front door, where he was met by a beaming Gertrude. "He may have had too many hot dogs and sodas," admitted Brian. "Of course he did. He was at a ball game," replied Gertrude. "Thanks so much for taking him and bringing him back safely." "It was my pleasure." "Scooter's a great kid," Brian retorted. "I'll see you at the next game." Brian settled into a routine that worked well for him. He would get home, have a small breakfast, and then sleep from 9 to 3 o'clock. With the extra soundproofing and blackout curtains on his windows, he usually slept soundly. Brenda occasionally complained about him always sleeping in his man cave, even on weekends, but she left the subject alone as soon as Brian asked if she needed his help. He decided she was truly worried about Grant insisting on intimacy in her bedroom and being caught, which suited Brian fine. It indicated she wasn't contemplating asking for a divorce at the moment. His goal of remaining married until Tim graduated high school seemed attainable. Because he was getting less exercise as a foreman, Brian purchased a home gym machine that was advertised to provide a complete body workout. To his pleasant surprise, it worked as advertised, as long as he was diligent in using it. He attended all of Tim's baseball practices, and soon the coach had him working with a few kids off to the side while the coach worked with a different group of players. Tim was a pretty good player and showed signs of improvement, but Scooter was a real surprise to Brian. At the start of the season, Scooter showed some talent but was tentative and timid. Brian worked with him as much as he could, even spending a few hours on weekends practicing at the local park. Since he wasn't having sex, Brian took the opportunity to play baseball with the boys. As Scooter's confidence grew, his level of play increased dramatically. By the season's halfway point, Scooter was batting cleanup and playing shortstop at a high level, while Tim was the starting center fielder and batting third. Brian was tremendously proud of both boys' accomplishments. One thing Brian couldn't help but notice was the attention some of the kids' mothers had begun paying to him. For some reason, his jokes actually made them laugh, and his efforts with the kids were constantly praised. A few mothers would bake something for the team, but always made sure he received a piece of whatever it was. Tim's friendship with Scooter and the time Brian spent with the boys naturally led to him spending more time with Gertrude. Brian thought of her as a smart friend with a great sense of humor, so he decided to ask her if she had noticed the increased interest from the mothers. "I may be way off base here, Minks, but I have to ask you a bit of a personal question," began Brian. "Almost a B cup," was Gertrude's quick response. "What? I don't get it," admitted Brian. "When men preface a question to a lady by saying it's personal, aren't they usually going to ask her about her bra size?" "Well, yeah, that's usually true," agreed Brian with a chuckle. "In this case, I was going to ask if you've noticed some of the mothers treating me differently the last couple of weeks. Do you think they seem a little friendlier lately?" "Well, aren't you observant?" retorted Gertrude. "You really don't know what's going on, do you?" "I'd need more information regarding the what to which you refer before I could answer that question," mused Brian. "I understand the infield fly rule, and I know you never make the first or last out of an inning at third base. You aren't referring to those baseball axioms, are you?" "No, I was talking about the unwritten rule of never bunting or stealing bases when you have a huge lead," quipped Gertrude before becoming more serious. "If you've been paying attention, you know the friendliest team mothers are also single mothers. You're a great dad, a good-looking guy, and have a pretty decent job. That makes you a great catch in their book. What about the fact I'm a married man? Wouldn't they take that into consideration?" asked Brian. "They have," responded Scooter's mom. "That's why they haven't actually attempted to pursue you. No one has tried that yet, have they?" "No one has, and it hasn't been a problem," replied Brian. "I'm married, so I obviously can't be a good catch for anyone. Brian, I don't like being the one to tell you this, but we're friends, so it falls on me. The mothers all know your wife is cheating on you. That's not all. The rumor is she's cut you off from intimacy. You don't sleep together, and it's a foregone conclusion you'll become available in the not-too-distant future. These women want to be ready for you as soon as you're free." Brian was stunned by Gertrude's revelation. How could so many people know about his personal situation? Who would possibly know about his private life or lack thereof? Then it hit him. Brenda must have mentioned their issues, and someone had spread the word. "Are you referring to your wife or her partner?" asked Gertrude, trying to lighten the mood. "I have to say, you don't seem all that surprised by the rumors. Did you already suspect Brenda was cheating?" "No, I never suspected," answered Brian. "You had no idea at all?" asked the disbelieving Gertrude. "I knew she was cheating. I just never suspected it until I caught her and Grant together. I went from having no clue to certain in a matter of seconds. I completely skipped being suspicious. That revelation creates more questions than it answers," stated his confused friend. "You saw them together, and yet you're still married, and you're not in prison. You're not a swinger or someone who likes to watch, are you?" "I'm not," assured Brian. "I decided to adjust my priorities. Spending quality time with Tim and not being a part-time dad became my main goal. Living with Brenda rather than divorcing her seemed like the best way to achieve that. I started working nights, which affected our relationship, and I built a separate apartment over my detached garage to have my own space. I told Brenda it was for sleeping during the day without being disturbed. She wasn't thrilled about the arrangement, but Grant kept her informed about every detail. She thinks her affair is a secret and wants to keep it that way. I haven't shared the truth with her, and I won't be intimate with her for any reason. I went to the clinic and got tested for STDs. I'm clean, and I plan to keep it that way." "You're serious?" Gertrude asked. "How can she treat you like that? What a jerk that guy is. All the single moms think you'd be a great catch." Gertrude continued. "I think you may have an inflated opinion of my desirability. I've never been the matinee idol type. I do have a good job, so that might make me look better to some of the more interested women," Brian offered. "Are you kidding? Look how handsome you are." "You have a wonderful smile," pointed out Gertrude. "You're strong, kind, smart, and great with kids. If I weren't so plain-looking, I might have already shown some interest myself. I think I'd better shut up." "Thanks for being a good enough friend to tell me what people are saying and thinking," replied Brian with a frown. "I didn't realize everyone knew about my situation. It's pretty embarrassing. I can't keep my own wife happy. You're a good man who wants to be a good father to his son. You're strong enough to endure this, so you can have a great relationship with Tim. Horace thinks you're pretty cool too," Gertrude said. "Who?" asked Brian. "You must be feeling better if you can tease me about Horace's name," observed Gertrude with a smile. "You're a great friend. You've kept me from getting my head stuck too far up my butt," Brian said. "I just hope Tim doesn't find out that things are not going well at home," revealed Gertrude. "Horace says Tim knows things aren't right at home. You pretty much avoid his mother, so he's bound to hear something when so many people know about it," she replied. "You know what worries me?" added Gertrude. "Horace is sweet on Heather Grant. How awkward is that for him and for me? She's a nice girl. She's got no idea what her father is like. I'm just glad Tim isn't the one interested in Heather," stated Brian. "What a mess that would be. I should be happy for small favors. Horace tells me Tim is pretty interested in Holly Ingram, but that shouldn't surprise you much. She comes to every game and cheers for every move he makes," said a smiling Gertrude. "Yes, I've noticed her hanging around. She seems like a nice girl. I knew her dad and uncles in school. They're a good family," recalled Brian. 2 nights later, Tim's team was playing in the first round of the district championships. Brian realized as game time drew closer that he was probably more nervous than Tim. It didn't help that the usual 3 single mothers were determined to get his attention. Norma Wilson wore a top that exposed a good portion of her figure and frequently leaned over in front of Brian, finding reasons to pick something up. Brandy Dorn kept her figure covered but wore a very tight sweater. accentuating her appearance. She constantly asked Brian questions about the team and the players. Gillian Patterson was less subtle. For some reason, she stood close enough to Brian that her side frequently brushed against him. Gertrude gave him a knowing smirk as she handed him a soda and a hot dog before returning to her seat on the first base side of the diamond. Brian noticed that all three women found reasons to leave his vicinity simultaneously. He thought it was odd until he heard a familiar voice behind him. "I thought I'd join my husband this afternoon to watch my son play. I didn't realize I'd have to wade through so many admirers to reach him," observed Brenda more loudly than necessary. "What's going on?" "The game hasn't started yet, but Tim looked pretty good in batting practice," replied Brian, trying to deflect the question. "Nice try, but why were those women hanging around you like that?" "It's a good thing you aren't allergic to silicone," Brenda said. "If you're asking me to explain the workings of the female mind, you're out of luck." "I have no idea," admitted Brian. "I'm even surprised you're here. My son is playing in an important game. I'm here to support him, obviously. Other mothers are here too, but apparently, some of them are not just here for their kids," Brenda observed. "How did you get away from your obligations today?" Brian asked. Brenda glanced at her husband when he mentioned her obligations. She briefly wondered if he was implying something, but dismissed the thought quickly. If he had any suspicions, he would have been much angrier and far more confrontational. One thing she knew about Brian was he would never accept her cheating quietly if he knew. He'd let her know in a very obvious way. "I made time because this game is important for Tim, which makes it important for me. I've hardly seen you since you went on the night shift, so I thought it would be nice to spend some time together cheering for Tim," reasoned Brenda. As Brenda and Brian sat down in the bleachers, she noticed she was being watched by several of the other mothers, and they didn't appear to be all that friendly. Brenda wondered about that. What could she have possibly done to annoy the other mothers? This was the first game she had attended, and she had no other interactions with any of them, so she couldn't think of a reason for them to dislike her. Brenda then noticed Gertrude sitting off to the side as usual. Although Gertrude failed to stand out in any particular way, Brenda did notice that her hair had been professionally styled, and she looked nice in a pair of shorts that seemed a bit short for the cool temperatures of the day. The game began, and Brian's attention was riveted on the playing field. The first two batters struck out before Tim stepped into the batter's box. Brenda was worried for her son when she saw how fast the first pitch was and how close it came to his head. The second pitch was low and away from Tim, but he connected solidly and lined it over first base for a stand-up double. Scooter was the next batter. Brenda noticed that he seemed older, stronger, and more confident than he had been last summer. The first pitch popped into the catcher's mitt close to Scooter's head. If he hadn't leaned back, it might have hit him. Brenda heard Brian chuckle as Scooter prepared for the next pitch. "Trying to intimidate those two boys is a big mistake," stated Brian to those within hearing. "I just hope the pitcher tries to sneak a fastball by Scooter." The other spectators nodded in agreement as the pitcher went into his delivery. He was a hard thrower and put extra effort into the next pitch. There was a loud crack as Scooter's bat met the baseball as it crossed the plate. Cheers and applause echoed across the bleachers as the ball disappeared over the center field fence. Tim trotted across the plate and waited for his friend to touch home plate before exchanging high fives. Gertrude was beaming with pride as her son circled the bases. She glanced over at Brian and saw small tears on his cheeks. He had spent countless hours working on fielding and batting with Tim and Scooter, and his pleasure and pride were almost palpable. Gertrude was extremely grateful for the mentoring Brian had provided her son. Since their arrival, Horace had been growing into a fine young man, and Brian had played a huge part in his character development. Brenda drove to the pizza shop to join Brian and Tim as the team celebrated the win. She found a parking space quite far from the door, and by the time she entered the restaurant, she saw both Norma Wilson and Brandy Dorn standing close to her husband. They seemed to be interacting with him while he helped sort out the drinks for the boys. Brenda wasn't surprised when they seemed to disperse as she approached. It made her mentally revisit a conversation she had 2 weeks prior with her lover, Bill Grant. "It's about time we got it on in your bed, don't you think?" Bill had said as Brenda was getting dressed after a previous encounter. "Banging you in your husband's bed really gets my motor running. You said you wouldn't do it in our bed again until Brian and I had sex," Brenda reminded him. "I'm not comfortable risking it." "Are you actually telling me you haven't had sex with your husband since the day we were together in your house?" asked her incredulous lover. "You said I should shut him off for as long as I could, and you wouldn't press me to have sex in our house until he made love to me. He went on night shift that day and has been sleeping in a room over the garage. We haven't even shared a handshake since," Brenda explained. "That's just plain crazy," replied Bill. "He's too young, and you're too attractive for him to lose interest in sex. Is he gay? Does he have a girlfriend or something?" "He's certainly not gay," insisted Brenda. "He's very masculine. He's just working nights and is tired most of the time. He only shows up for dinner except on weekends when he does yard work and things. No normal man, married to someone like you, would willingly go without. Maybe he's seeing someone else. That should make it easier for us to get together," Bill said. "He's getting his, and I'm getting what used to be his. Brian would never be unfaithful to me," Brenda stated firmly. "He takes our marriage vows very seriously. He isn't the kind of man to sneak around and engage in an affair." "Is that what you think you're doing?" Bill asked. "Well, no. This is just a temporary thing. He's been too busy with work and Tim's baseball to pay much attention to me. I deserve a little fun. I work hard to keep the house, make meals, and work full-time," Brenda reasoned. "We know this won't last." Bill smiled as he considered Brenda's words. "We'll just enjoy the ride while it lasts. Give me a day I can spend with you." As Brenda recalled Bill's words, she became concerned as she watched the 2 women who had been hovering around Brian slink away. It was clear that he had attracted some attention. She realized she needed to protect her marriage from these advances. Then she noticed Gertrude sitting off by herself. Brenda quickly formulated a plan, put on a big smile, and sat down next to a surprised Gertrude. "It's good to see you again, Gertrude. Horace has become quite a good ball player, and he's a very nice boy. You should be proud of him." "I am," admitted a wary Gertrude. "Tim is doing very well too. The time Brian has spent with him is paying off. He's really been a great mentor for Horace." "Yeah, sometimes Brian is too good," responded Brenda, seeing an opportunity for her proposal. "I'm sure you've noticed how some of the women are always around him. I was wondering if you could help me out. I know Brian would never stray under normal conditions, but those women seem quite interested. Could you help keep an eye on him?" "How do you expect me to help?" asked Gertrude. "Maybe just stay close when I'm not around. I know I can trust Brian with you. If you could keep him company, it might discourage these women from trying to get too close. I'm planning to suggest to Brian that he stay closer to you during games and practices. It might make it seem like he's settled down, which could help keep those women away," Brenda explained. "I see. So you're asking me to be a presence to help deter other women from pursuing Brian," Gertrude said, somewhat incredulously. "You feel I'm a good choice because I'm not very flashy." "I wouldn't put it that way. I just know that Brian is less likely to be tempted if he's around someone who doesn't fit a certain type. You'd be helping him stay true to his commitments," Brenda said. "You feel that cheating is a deal breaker?" Gertrude asked thoughtfully. "Yes," Brenda replied firmly. "I love my husband, but infidelity would end our marriage. I can't condone cheating at all. It destroys the marriage contract." "I understand your perspective. Fidelity and loyalty are important," acknowledged Gertrude. "I agree that cheating breaks the commitment. I'll do what I can to help." "Thank you. I'll make sure to explain everything to Brian," Brenda said as she prepared to leave. "I really appreciate your help." As Brenda left to join her husband, Brian spoke at the next day's practice. "Brenda wanted to talk before I left for work. The gist of it is that there are too many single mothers around, and she thinks I'd be safer if I stayed close to Gertrude. You know you're never truly safe from unwanted attention, joked Gertrude. But I appreciate the compliment. Gertrude, you're one of the most attractive people I've met, Brian said earnestly. You're a great person. Wow, you just made my job harder, admitted Gertrude with a blush. I'll make an appointment for a night checkup after the baseball season. Brian laughed, noting the reactions of the other single mothers as Gertrude stayed close by his side. It was clear that the presence of someone like Gertrude changed the dynamics, reducing unwanted attention. The team's next game required a 3-hour drive to Middleburg. The team decided to travel the day before the game and spend the night at a hotel to ensure they were rested. Brian had given rides to Jake Winston's parents and Gertrude. The conversation on the way focused on the team's chances and the upcoming challenges. Upon arriving at the hotel, Brian helped Ralph Winston with their luggage. Some parents, including the Winstons, volunteered to chaperone and stayed at the same hotel. Other parents had to book different accommodations due to the high number of visitors for the games. Before Tim boarded the bus, Brian reminded him that he wouldn't be staying at the same hotel, but assured him he'd be at the practice the next morning. What hotel are you staying at? Brian asked as they reached the hotel. The same hotel you are, was Gertrude's simple response. I never told you which hotel I was using. How did you find out? Asked the perplexed Brian. I didn't, was the brief response. How do you know we're at the same hotel? It's pretty busy this weekend. You might not get a room at the last minute, Brian pointed out. I'm sure something will come up, replied Gertrude with a big grin, confusing Brian further. Brian arrived at his hotel a few minutes later and asked Gertrude, do you want to see if you can get a room while I check in? I can wait around to be sure you find something. Thanks, but I'll just wait here. I'll be fine, she insisted. Brian was beginning to see the light as he checked in and picked up his room access cards. He returned to his truck to find Gertrude waiting. Is there any chance you'd like one of these cards to my room? He asked. It's room 207. What a thoughtful gesture, exclaimed Gertrude as she stepped from the car, accepted the key, and gave Brian a friendly kiss on the cheek. Let's get to bed. It's going to be a long night. Brian was more tired the next morning than he had been when he went to bed. He had struggled with the reality of breaking his marriage vows, but Gertrude helped him through it. Let's look at this logically. Brenda has not only been unfaithful, but has agreed to deny you sexually. Even if she hadn't, she would still be putting your health at risk. Effectively, she has made sexual relations with her both unsafe and undesirable. She has released you from your vows and your marriage contract. I haven't had sex in over 2 years, and I'm clean. You were tested after discovering Brenda's infidelity, and you're clean too. I went on the pill a month ago in hopes of being with you. Can you honestly give me one reason we shouldn't be together? Gertrude asked. Is it my looks? Your wife thought I was a good choice because she knew you wouldn't be attracted to me, she continued. Am I just not desirable? Gertrude, you're extremely desirable. Don't ever suggest otherwise, Brian said earnestly. I've never cheated on Brenda, and it's taking some adjustment to my thinking, but you've made a strong case for us being together. I'm ready. There's something else you need to know, replied Gertrude. Both my parents are in hospice and aren't expected to live much longer. My brother has been sending game films of Horace to a friend who is the baseball coach at a prestigious prep school in the LA area. If Horace gets a baseball scholarship for next year, we'll probably move back. I like you a lot, but we're not looking at a lasting relationship. It can't last. Look at us. You're a good-looking married man with a cheating wife, and I'm a plain Jane with a son who has a chance at a scholarship. I have to do what's best for Horace. That's great to hear about Horace, stated Brian proudly. He's a talented player, and I'm glad he'll have a chance to hone his skills and gain a good education. You're a big reason he's being considered by better schools. I know how much time and work you've put in with him. It's ironic that your mentorship of my son actually gave us the opportunity to move back to away from you. I don't think I'll be very good at a one-night stand, Brian admitted. It might be better to forego it entirely than have one night and then go back to being distant. You silly man, Gertrude replied. I said we'll probably move back to LA for the next school year, which is over 6 months away. A guy could have a lot of fun in that time, unless he's too old for a steady diet of excitement. That's something we'll just have to find out. Will you live up to your nickname? Brian joked. I will for you, promised Gertrude. When you want me, just whistle, and I'll teach you how. I've always been told my whistling is quite respectable, Brian quipped. Then you're not doing it right, retorted Gertrude. The baseball team went on to win the state championship, and Horace was awarded a scholarship to a prestigious California prep school. Both of Gertrude's parents passed away before Thanksgiving, within a week of each other. Brian and Tim attended their funerals, and Brian met Gertrude's brother, Dexter, who he liked immediately. Brian, meet my brother Dexter, introduced Gertrude. Dexter, this is Horace's baseball mentor, and our good friend Brian. Holy, exclaimed Brian. Your name is Dexter, right? Yes, agreed Gertrude's brother. Only Gertrude and my folks ever call me Dexter. Everyone else calls me Grim. What do you call my sister? I call her Minks, but don't ask why, Dexter insisted. I don't think I have to ask, replied Grim with a laugh. Brian spent Thanksgiving with Brenda and Tim at her parents' house. For the first time in months, Brian found himself preparing for bed with Brenda. They always stayed over Thanksgiving night, and Brian couldn't come up with a good excuse to change that tradition. Brenda took her time removing her clothes in front of Brian. He tried to keep his reaction subdued, but his body gradually responded to the visual stimulation. Brenda was a very attractive woman with a nicely toned body. We haven't been intimate in a very long time, said Brenda. You must be in need of some affection by now. Make love to me. Brian felt uneasy about his next comment, even as he replied, You finally admit you need some attention. I knew you'd break. I'll be glad to make you feel better for the holiday. You won't be getting any affection for years with that attitude, snarled Brenda. What's wrong with you? You can just forget I was thinking of allowing you to even touch me. Brian's only response was to roll over, turning his back to Brenda. Although it was out of character for him, it achieved his objective of avoiding intimacy with her. He regretted that his marriage had deteriorated to this point. Brenda was troubled by Brian's comment, which made sleep difficult as she lay next to him. She wondered if he knew about her affair, or if he was just upset because they hadn't been intimate lately. She decided she would have to discuss it with Bill. She needed to avoid making her husband suspicious, as that could ruin her marriage. Brian followed a routine when working the night shift. He would go home, eat a small breakfast, and go to bed by 9 a.m. often. He would be awakened around 2 p.m. by Gertrude joining him in bed. They would spend some time together before she left to be home when her son returned from school. With baseball season over, this routine allowed Brian to shower and shave before Tim came home from school. Brian would often catch a nap in the evening before heading to work. This arrangement worked well for both Brian and Gertrude. One night in early December, Brian received a call from Tim shortly after arriving at work. Dad, Scooter, and I are out with Heather and Holly in Heather's car. You said we could be out until midnight because there's no school tomorrow. We have a problem. Heather was driving her mom's car, and we have a flat tire. There's no spare in the trunk. We're stranded on D Street, and I'm worried. I see a few guys down by the arcade looking this way. You're broke down on D Street by the arcade, cursed Brian. We'll discuss this later. Is Heather driving that Corolla? Yeah, it's a 2017 Corolla, replied Tim. I'll find a wheel and tire that fits and be right there. Keep your doors locked and call the cops if you have any trouble. Take care of those girls, Brian instructed. He hung up and quickly found Gus, a bearded man who drove a Corolla. Gus, do you still drive that Corolla? Asked Brian. I need a mounted tire that fits your car, and I need it right now. As Brian spoke to Gus, Jack Reynolds walked by. Jack was Holly's uncle, and Brian thought of asking for his help. "Jack, my son, and some friends are stuck on D Street with a flat tire and no spare. Holly is with them. I'm getting a mounted tire from Gus and heading over. I'd appreciate it if you rode along. I have a real spare tire, not just a donut," said Gus. "Let's take my car and get down there now," Jack agreed. Gus, Jack, and Brian immediately headed for the parking lot, concerned about the kids being in that part of town late at night. Meanwhile, Brenda was lying in bed with Bill, enjoying the warmth after their time together. When Bill's phone rang, he glanced at the caller ID. "Damn it, it's Heather. I have to answer it, or she'll keep calling," Bill said. Brenda could only hear one side of the conversation, but was concerned about what she overheard. "Why in hell are you kids down there?" "Well, that's too bad. Those boys are old enough to handle a problem like that. Call AAA. It's not my fault your mother didn't keep a spare tire in her car." "What was that all about?" asked Brenda once Bill ended the call. "Nothing to worry about," Bill replied as he reached over. "Heather had a flat tire, but she was calling AAA to get it fixed." Several young toughs were hanging around Heather's car when Brian and his friends arrived. Brian quickly stepped out, pulling the jack and tire iron from Gus's trunk. Gus brought the spare tire while Jack tapped on the driver's side window, motioning for Heather to lower it so he could speak to her. "You kids stay put until we get the tire changed. If these guys cause any trouble, we'll handle it. Holly, you'll be explaining to your mother why you're on D Street," Brian said. Brian carried the jack over to the flat rear tire and positioned it under the frame. He cranked it until it was tight and then moved to the front of the tire to loosen the lug nuts. The obvious leader of the group of tough guys approached Jack as Brian worked on the tire. "You're on our turf here. You need my permission before you mess with that car." Before Jack could respond, Brian swiftly used the tire iron to push the guy back. The man dropped to his knees and then rolled on the ground, rubbing his shins and cursing. Brian grabbed the man by the collar and dragged him face down to lie near the flat tire, then sat on his back and continued working on the lug nuts. The two nearest gang members rushed over, apparently intent on getting Brian off their leader. Jack quickly intervened, knocking the first one out with a single hit. Gus moved forward, and the second guy retreated. "Raise the car up a bit, and I'll pull the tire," Brian instructed Jack calmly. Jack proceeded to crank the car higher as the gang members shouted insults at them. The guy under Brian tried to squirm out from beneath him, but Brian firmly kept him in place. After removing the flat tire and sliding the new one into place, Brian tightened the lug nuts. He accidentally kicked the leader as he stepped over him. "Are you guys done talking?" Brian asked as he approached the gang members, casually tossing the tire iron from hand to hand. The group scattered. "Get out of here," instructed Jack as Brian backed the gang away from the car. "Be careful not to drag over those guys lying in the street, and stay away from this part of town." The three men got back into Gus's car and followed Heather to the next intersection, turning toward the kids' home area. "I can't believe you hit that guy in the shins like that," laughed Gus. "He went down like a sack of potatoes. Thanks for inviting me along." Jack added, "My hand hurts, but it felt great to knock that guy out. And then you sat on him while changing the tire. That was something." The men were still laughing and recounting their experience as they returned to their jobs. By morning, the story had spread through the entire plant. Tales of daring and adventure were popular on the night shift, helping everyone stay alert and take their minds off the fatigue. The next afternoon, as Brian was waking up, Gertrude jumped into his bed and greeted him warmly. "Horace told me what happened last night. You were great. Thanks for taking care of the kids like that. You're about to get very lucky. I would have been over sooner, but I had to wait for Horace and Tim to visit the girls since there's no school today." Brenda had only been at work for an hour when Sue Blaine approached her at the water cooler, clearly wanting to discuss something. "I heard how Brian, Jack Reynolds, and Gus Benson handled some tough guys who were harassing the kid's car on D Street. A tire iron to the shins can really take the fight out of someone. Brenda immediately pieced together that Heather had called her father for help the previous night, but he had brushed her off. Sue's mention of kids indicated that Holly, Horace, and Tim were all involved. Brenda was furious with Bill Grant, who had dismissed Heather's call for help in favor of his own interests. Brian, Gus, and Jack had acted responsibly and protected the kids from a dangerous situation, while Bill had ignored his daughter's distress. Feeling deeply hurt and disillusioned, Brenda confronted Bill later in the break room. "Heather called you for help last night, and you ignored her. Those kids could have been in serious danger, and you told her to call AAA. What kind of father are you?" Brenda demanded. "It all worked out," Bill replied glibly. "Your husband and some of his buddies saved the day. So what's the problem?" Brian acted like a real man. "You turned your back on your daughter, and that's the problem," Brenda snapped. "My son was in that car. If your husband is so special, why am I the one dealing with him while he hasn't been attentive in months?" Bill chuckled. "Well, all the superhero acts in the world won't change the fact that I'm better at certain things. Being a man is about more than that." "Being a man has nothing to do with that," Brenda retorted. "Brian is more of a man than you'll ever be." Bill dismissed her with a shrug. "You say that, but last night you were enthusiastic when I was with you. I've always had the upper hand." "That's it. We're through," Brenda declared. "Don't ever try to talk to me again. I want nothing to do with you." "Whatever," Bill responded calmly. "There are plenty of women out there looking for someone like me. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." Brenda, overcome with emotion, ran from the room in tears. She felt regretful for her actions, having jeopardized her marriage and family for someone who didn't value her. She hoped Brian would never find out about her mistakes. Gertrude had just spent time with Brian when she heard sniffling behind her. Surprised, she turned to find Brenda watching her, with tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could you do this to me?" Brenda cried. "I trusted you both, and look what happened." "I'm simply doing as you asked," Gertrude said, starting to get dressed. "You wanted me to keep those women away from Brian. I've done that. I didn't want to be in this situation either, but I was here to help." "I didn't want you to sleep with him," Brenda said, her anger growing. "I can't believe Brian would cheat on me, especially with you." "I know it's hard to accept," Gertrude replied, "but sometimes people act on their needs. Bill didn't want you having a physical relationship with Brian, so Brian turned to someone else. I was available at the time." "Why didn't Brian say anything?" Brenda asked, her tears continuing to flow. "Why did he let Bill and me continue for so long?" "You're a smart girl," Gertrude said. "What would most men do when they find out their wife is cheating? They'd get angry and possibly divorce her. Brian chose to stay for Tim and to keep things stable for him." Brenda realized the situation. "So Brian stayed for Tim, not for me. We've been living like a divorced couple, just not officially." "Exactly," Gertrude agreed. "He wanted to stay close to Tim and be the best father he could be. That's why he's been around, despite the emotional distance." "I'm ending things with Bill," Brenda said. "I told him I never want to see him again after he refused to help his daughter." "Sometimes you have to make tough choices," Gertrude said. "Even cheaters have limits. I don't plan on being involved with Brian long term. Horace and I will be moving back to LA before school starts." Brenda wiped her tears away. "So, what happens now?" "Brian and I are temporarily enjoying each other's company," Gertrude explained. "I might help him find a new partner when the time comes. I didn't steal your husband. I was just here when things fell apart." Brenda was resolute. "I won't allow this to continue." "What kind of father are you?" Brenda insisted. "You have no right to be with him." "I was given that right by you," Minks replied. "As soon as you decided to be with Bill Grant, you essentially released Brian from any obligations he may have had toward you. He and I are exclusive. We trust each other." Brian has been told that he can't be involved with anyone else if he wants to keep me around. Brenda was shocked. Could Bill have been with someone else too? I need to get tested. That's a valid concern, Minks said. But for now, just keep your distance from Brian while I'm around. I'll continue to support him, and you should focus on your own issues. Brenda shook her head. You're leaving in a few months, and I plan to show Brian just how good a partner I can be. He won't need you once you're gone. Brian knows I'm committed to him while you've been involved with someone else, Minks said. I'm effectively managing the relationship. I won't let Brian be involved with you while we're together, as there's a risk of disease. I've learned that there's more to a relationship than just physical attraction, Brenda said. Sex without love or commitment feels demeaning. I'll focus on being the wife I should be, while you're just offering him physical attention. Understood, Minks replied. I'll continue to support Brian in the way he needs. You can focus on maintaining your role as his partner. Brenda pleaded, I'm truly sorry for how I've disrespected you and Brian. Can you ever forgive me? Minks replied, Brian might forgive you eventually, but regaining his trust is another matter. Cheating always presents a significant challenge. I suggest you use this time to reflect on what you've lost and learn from it. Brian then spoke to Brenda. I'm giving you two choices. Either you start divorce proceedings, which might damage my relationship with our son, or you stay and keep up appearances while I continue my life with Minks. If you choose the first option, I have a video of you with Bill that I could share. Otherwise, we can continue as we are until our son is out of school. Is there anything else you want to say? Before Brenda could respond, Minks added, You once said cheating was a deal breaker. Your actions make you a hypocrite. Brenda left the room, defeated. In the final confrontation, Brenda asked, What does she have that I don't? I love you, and I've tried everything. Brian responded, She has my trust, my love and respect. She doesn't betray me like you have. Brian filed for divorce as soon as his son left for prep school, citing irreconcilable differences to expedite the process. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. On the day of the divorce, Brenda approached Brian and handed him a letter. To her shock, Brian simply tossed the letter into a trash can. Seeing this, Brenda collapsed on the ground in tears. You won't even accept my apology and goodbye, she cried. Brian glanced at her and said, Not worth the effort, before walking away. Brian took a loan from his father to buy Brenda's share of the house and paid a lump sum as alimony. Since their son was now 18, there was no child support required. 3 months later, Bill Grant was kidnapped by 3 men outside a local bar. After 3 weeks of searching, some of his remains were discovered in a large plastic drum dumped in the woods outside the city. The police suspected the work of a copycat killer who used the same method as Santiago Mesa Lopes, known as El Pasolo. The investigation pointed to a husband of a woman Bill had been dating, but the case was closed when none of the suspects could be linked to the crime. 1 year after Brian and Brenda's divorce, Brian and Minks married in a small ceremony. Tim and Horace were happy as they now considered each other as brothers. Although Tim was initially unhappy about his father's divorce from his mother, he changed his opinion after Brian showed him a video explaining the situation. Brian and Minks did not have any other children but were content with their family life. 7 years later, at Tim's wedding, Brian and Minks were seated at the parents' table. Brenda was notably absent from the wedding. Brian glanced at Minks during the reception and whispered, You know, I never thought I'd be this happy again. Minks smiled softly. Well, you just needed the right person by your side. As they watched their son dance with his new wife, Brian reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had learned that trust, love, and honesty were the foundation of any relationship, and that betrayal, once uncovered, could never truly be mended. Minks had been his support through the darkest times, and now, standing beside him, she was his future. Together, they had built a life from the ashes of his broken marriage, one based on mutual respect and deep understanding. And as the evening wore on, Brian felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that despite everything, He had made the right choices. He had his son, his new family, and the love of a woman who had stood by him when he needed it most. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.